Cesar, your expedition very much had to do with the idea of mapping as well, mapping the gaze, mapping as cartography. And I was wondering if you could talk about that also in relation to fiction and, you know, the stories and the narratives that are created on these explorations.
The idea of cartography or mapping wasn't related just to the Papua New Guinea expedition. It's sort of the organizing mechanism for all of what I'm thinking about in terms of my itinerary or my project of 3 expeditions and 3 convenings. And mapping is fascinating for many reasons. But a couple of years ago, I was introduced to the maps of Piri Reis. He was a Turkish pirate who was commissioned at the time to put together what is now the oldest surviving map of the New World. There's no sense of directions in the maps, but they're beautiful artworks. And they sort of, you see boats in the middles of land masses. And it was and then towards the later part of his life, it was sort of realized that he actually was never a seaman. He used maps and narratives and accounts and stories of others to put together what we understood for a very long time as the first map of the New World. And all of it sort of spurred or came to be via word of mouth and via the exchange of these accounts. And the process of mapping, so that's sort of what spurred and inspired this idea and this interest that I've had for a very long time. And when asked to do a project that had at the very core of its intention or its mission to try to redefine the culture of exploration, I was fascinated about what that would do for the idea of the map. Because when we receive a map, it is both a possibility, but it's also an endpoint. It could lead to a destination, but it's a destination that somebody has already experienced. It's a kind of othered reality. When you really venture onto an unknown, there's no chart of it. And so the map represents really an endpoint rather than a beginning, and yet it's still a beginning on the beginning of a journey. So it's this really interesting paradox and this condition, a very uncomfortable condition of what does it mean for us to try to create new ways of existing in the world, and then inevitably those ways become other standards and other rubrics that other people are going to continue to change. So I was very fascinated by how the map could stand in to sort of anchor a lot of these questions and problems. That it is a project that's looking at histories of exploration, trying to create new systems of knowledge and new ways of existing in the world. And yet at the same time, if and when we achieve that, it'll just sort of create another paradigm and another standard that other people are going to have to change. So I love the cyclical nature of that. And that's why mapping became such a point of departure, because I think about it in terms of the itinerary of the project as a structure, but I also think about it as an idea that envelops a lot of the problematics that I think the current is trying to tackle in a very reflexive way.
And Filipa, speaking about creating these narratives or maps, I'm wondering if you could talk about your interest in underwater cinematography, because it's also like a certain representation of a space and of a narrative that is created. And I know that this is an interest of yours, so I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to the expeditions and your interest in fiction.
One of the main discoveries while preparing this, while preparing the trip, while also preparing the materials to share with the other fellows and the other people who were going to share the space of the boat with us, and also that unfolded in different ways while being on board of the boat, was trying to comprehend the way in which our conceptions of the sea, our conceptions of life underwater, our relation to a territory that more often than not is perceived as something to traverse, but as a flat land that it allows us to go from A to B, has been so much shaped by literature and in large part by cinema. So how has cinema been such a fundamental element for the constitution of our imaginary of the sea, both on our attraction towards it and our development of the tropes of paradise, for instance, and of the paradise isolated island, but also in relation to our fears and our very rational phobias, as when we, for the first time encountered this group of sharks, and suddenly I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, and somehow I could almost blame Steven Spielberg for having me taught how to fear sharks. No? And I could hear the music of a shark coming whenever I looked at it. And from these both rational and irrational reactions to encountering the sea in a very different way, I started being very interested in comprehending how nature, and in particular marine nature, has been framed and has been represented in a mode which is extremely safe, and it's extremely comfortable for us viewers. We go to a movie theater, we sit, and we have this sort of a membrane, which is the screen, which is not that different from the aquarium in the sense of being an apparatus that contains a form of life, either a real one as in the aquarium, or a life that has been depicted by film and is brought to us, allowing our eyes to encounter it, and being edited as well as in the aquarium. Also in film, this natural life is edited in order for us to see it there in this site. And this, of course, relates very much to my interest in comprehending the forms of narrative that can emerge from those who have been thinking and who have been inventing the perception, the concepts of the sea. You know? And also in parallel, also comprehending how so much of this cinematic imaginary and of the techniques to film underwater have actually been developed with different aims. I mean, so much of underwater capture materials come from military development, no? Or how so much of all the history of the attempts to document and to study life underwater have then informed different forms of filmmaking, from documentary to fiction and so on and so forth. So let's say that by being in a container that is in itself a vessel that takes us it takes us within a privileged mode of observing the sea, has led me to think of all the modes that have been bringing the sea towards our human gaze, and in what ways have we been focusing on the sea, or in the films themselves, in the techniques, in the stories, in the genres, in the attempts to frame the sea. And eventually, how can we invent and collaborate even with other species, with other forms of intelligence, to not only represent the sea, but also bring the voice of the sea closer to us, and see how can we contribute somehow to the raise of an environmental, ecological conscious by making these film works, artworks, works of literature that are exploring this terrain that is so much layered with history and with modes of interpretation.
Great. And I have one last question for both of you. Namely, what do you think the current can do, or what do you think these expeditions can do? Because now you have some experience, both of you, having been on that first expedition, having participated in convening in Jamaica, being here now in Lopud, where we're also, partly speaking about what happened on the expeditions, partly also connecting to the more expanded network and fellows. So, how has your idea of the project changed?
Shall I start?
Mm-hmm.
One of the most relevant aspects of what the current can do, in my opinion, is what the current is already doing, and is inventing new formats of bringing people together and of sharing ideas and sharing materials beyond the more conventional, especially when thinking in relation to the presentation modes of the arts, with the more conventional modes of rendering, and I'm thinking about the exhibition, for instance, or the catalogue. And by putting people together and by bringing them to certain locations, the current is not only inventing and proposing this new format, which is a format that stands halfway through the itinerant school, the seminar and the expedition, but it's also changing and offering a possibility to radically alter our relation to geography and our relation to center and to periphery. At a certain point, you're in the middle of the South Pacific, and that becomes the center. You look on your cell phone when eventually you have internet, and you're in the center. The center is the center that you don't know, and you don't even know that map. So suddenly, the notion of remoteness and the notion of isolated radically changes, and you become very close to an area that before only existed in your idea of what a postcard is or what a nuclear disaster is, for instance. So I do think that the current is just pushing forward these swifting geographies and inventing new formats of sharing that are very much attentive to a balance between isolating and between a group of people that are within a chamber where they cannot exit, and moments where instead you share with others, and you again share with others, not necessarily in the locations that are considered central, but in areas that constitute dispersed communities of individuals who have similar visions, who have similar experiences to share, and because they are in very particular areas, those experiences become extremely intense. So, yes, for me it's already inventing formats and shifting locations, I'd say.
I think recently, in the past couple of years, there's been a real big impetus on trying to transform the exhibition format. I mean, always, right? Trying to shift or transform what it actually means to be putting on an exhibition. And I think what I believe the Current is doing very well, and it's strange because I came into the project before it was sort of called the Current. I had been in conversations with Marcus and Francesca about the Academy and what it meant, or whether it was a triennial. So there was a whole process even before the current structure exists of many other iterations that I saw that could have been this project, that thankfully were not. But I think that the most generative thing out of this is that it's transforming the logic of what an exhibition itself can be as a curator. A process sort of transforming the research process and the process of showing or sharing and having them be parallel, rather than have a very insular process of research that then attains some kind of representational form. That both things are happening simultaneously. That there's a certain way, or a certain way that time's operation shifts completely with that. And it does so because I think that it slows down for us in between expeditions, and we're able to process, and we're able to think, and we're able to write, and we're able to research, and then we're on the boat, and then it intensifies again. So the way that it sort of transforms that process has been a really interesting experience as a curator. I feel like I'm doing research for a show and doing the show simultaneously. And so my research, my feedback happens in dialogue with the fellows, with an audience, which has been very generative. And second, I think that this idea of transforming the logic of a final moment, or a conference, or a situation, or a more traditional sort of gathering, the idea that us going to Papua New Guinea, us going to French Polynesia, only 6 to 7 people go. And rather than attempt to do a one-to-one direct translation of the experience, to be able to create an environment in which people can go there to think about bigger ideas that they can be sort of placed in conversation with different contexts, I also think is something really generative that's happening in the current. Normally when you do an exhibition, there's an idea, there's a topic that's researched and looked at, but here it isn't so always one-to-one, right? We're looking at the relationships between Papua New Guinea and Kochi and Venice as a maritime center, And so that is also shifting our responsibility, I think, as curators in terms of what our role is in this process, where we're not organizing artworks or we're not organizing, there's not a final even location for where this is going to go. It's been liberating, to say the least. But I think that in changing the logic of those processes, it's created a very different way of working that, for me, has allowed me to look at how I'd like to get other people involved that aren't necessarily artists in ways that are less conventional.